The moment Nicolas Maduro was shaking hands with the Chinese envoy in Caracas, history was already moving faster than diplomacy. Hours later, US forces seized him. And in Beijing, alarm bells went off. I want you to pause here, because this is not just a dramatic episode in Venezuela. It is a stress test of the global order. China had just reaffirmed what it calls an all-weather partnership with Caracas, a phrase it reserves for relationships meant to survive crises. Then Donald Trump rewrote the rules by force. Beijing reacted sharply, condemning the US, calling for Maduro's release, rejecting the idea that any country can act as the world's police. But beneath the rhetoric lies something colder, more consequential: money, oil, leverage, and fear of precedent. If a government this close to China can be removed overnight, what does that say about power in today's world? If this kind of analysis matters to you, stay with me. Because to understand what happens next, we have to understand how we got here and why Venezuela matters far beyond its borders. What Trump did in Venezuela forces us to confront a bigger question: what happens when power moves faster than institutions? Venezuela is not just another crisis country. It sits at the intersection of ideology, resources, and global rivalry. For years, it has been a strategic node where US influence waned and China stepped in. Beijing did not just invest money, it invested in assumptions. That sovereignty would be respected, that debts would be honored, that partnerships labeled all-weather would not be shattered overnight by foreign troops. Trump's intervention breaks that logic. China's response was immediate and unusually direct. Its leaders rejected the idea of a single country acting as judge, jury, and enforcer. Its diplomats pushed the issue to the UN. Its financial regulators quietly asked banks a far more practical question: how exposed are we? Because behind the language of imperialism and international law lies a concrete concern. If the rules change in Venezuela, they can change anywhere. And to grasp why this worries Beijing so deeply, we need to go back to the origins of China's bet on Venezuela and how economics slowly turned into geopolitics. To understand China's anxiety today, we have to rewind the clock. China's relationship with Venezuela was built during a very specific moment in global history, a time when Beijing was expanding outward and Washington was looking elsewhere. Latin America became fertile ground. Venezuela, rich in oil but isolated politically, needed cash. China, flush with capital and hungry for long-term security, offered a simple mechanism: loans for oil, credit in exchange for crude. Money today, resources tomorrow. Over 2 decades, that arrangement deepened. Venezuela became one of the largest recipients of Chinese lending anywhere in the world. More than $100 billion in commitments, and by 2024, roughly $10 billion still outstanding. This was not charity. It was a system. Oil tankers moved east. Debt payments flowed back. China became the biggest buyer of Venezuelan crude, even though that oil ultimately represented only a small slice of China's total imports. The real asset was not the oil. It was predictability, and that predictability is exactly what Trump's intervention has now shattered. Because when history accelerates like this, systems break before contracts do. Then came the first rupture. In December, a tanker bound for China, believed to be carrying Venezuelan oil, was seized by US forces. At the time, it looked like a warning shot. In retrospect, it was a rehearsal. When Maduro himself was taken days later, the message became unmistakable. This was no longer pressure. This was removal. In China, the reaction was visceral. State officials condemned the operation. Social media filled with accusations of colonialism and imperial overreach, and just as telling, content celebrating Maduro's capture quietly disappeared. This was a crisis not only of diplomacy, but of psychology, because Beijing saw something dangerous taking shape, a precedent. If Washington could seize the leader of a sovereign state, one deeply intertwined with Chinese capital, then contracts, debts, and assurances suddenly looked fragile. China backed a UN Security Council debate. Its foreign minister rejected the idea of any nation acting as the world's judge. But behind the scenes, something else happened. Financial regulators asked Chinese banks to report their exposure to Venezuela. That single request tells you everything. If you want to understand how power really works, pay attention to moments like this. Because the visible crisis is only the surface, the deeper mechanism is just beginning to move. What sits beneath this crisis is not ideology, it is architecture. China's engagement with Venezuela was never about loyalty to Nicolas Maduro as a person. It was about a system designed to manage risk in unstable countries. Loans backed by future resources, long timelines, quiet leverage. In theory, it is elegant. China provides capital when others won't. The borrower repays not in cash, but in commodities. Politics fluctuate, but the pipeline keeps flowing. Trump's intervention strikes at the heart of that model. Because if a new government, especially one under US influence, decides to reorder creditors, the hierarchy matters. And under pressure, American claims could jump to the front of the line. Chinese banks, despite decades of engagement, could be pushed back. That is why the debt matters more than the oil. Venezuelan crude accounts for only a small share of China's imports. But unpaid loans represent something else: loss of credibility. If these arrangements fail here, every similar deal elsewhere becomes riskier. This is why some Chinese analysts talk about leverage, rare earth exports, negotiated restructuring, quiet bargaining behind public confrontation, because China does not want escalation. It wants predictability restored, or at least compensated, and yet the system is already under strain, which brings us to the next shock. Because the question is no longer how China protects its past investments, but how it prepares for what comes next. Then came the second escalation, and it was sharper. Donald Trump did not just remove a leader. He claimed the future. He said the United States would run Venezuela, not occupy it necessarily, but shape it, guide it, rebuild it using its oil. His Secretary of State went further. Venezuela's oil exports, Marco Rubio suggested, could be held hostage, used as leverage over whoever takes power next in Caracas. For Beijing, this was the moment the fog lifted. A US-backed government, even a nominally independent one, would change the entire equation. Negotiations would no longer be bilateral. They would be filtered through Washington. And that creates a dilemma. China does not want a direct confrontation with the US in Latin America, especially during a tense trade war. But it also cannot accept a precedent where its contracts are erased by regime change. So the crisis tightens. If China negotiates with the new leadership, it risks legitimizing the intervention. If it refuses, it risks losing billions. This is how great power conflict actually unfolds. Not with missiles, but with spreadsheets, oil flows, and quiet threats. And while governments calculate, there is another dimension often overlooked, the human one. Now, I want you to think about this from a different angle. Not Beijing, not Washington, but you, because when great powers collide, it is ordinary people who absorb the shock. If you are a Venezuelan citizen, this crisis is not abstract. It is not about debt hierarchies or oil contracts. It is about uncertainty layered on top of exhaustion. For years, your country has lived inside economic scarcity and political paralysis. Now, overnight, the entire system is reset by outside force. A leader removed, a future promised but not yet defined. Oil revenues may be frozen, assets leveraged, decisions delayed, while foreign capitals negotiate your fate. And here is the uncomfortable truth. When powerful countries fight over leverage, people become collateral. China worries about unpaid loans. The US talks about rebuilding. But on the ground, lives remain suspended between hope and fear. This is why these moments matter, because they remind us that global power is never neutral. It always lands somewhere. If this analysis resonates with you, share it, because understanding power is the first step to holding it accountable. And now we need to widen the lens, because what happens in Venezuela does not stay in Venezuela. Venezuela is a local crisis with global consequences. For China, Latin America is no longer a distant frontier. It is a strategic theater. Trade between China and the region has reached record levels. Diplomacy has intensified. Influence has grown quietly, methodically. Trump's intervention threatens to reverse that trajectory. If the US demonstrates that it can still unilaterally reshape governments in its traditional sphere of influence, every country in the region takes note. So does Beijing. Because this is not just about Venezuela. It is about whether China's expanding footprint in the Americas can survive direct confrontation with US power. Regional governments now face harder choices. Align too closely with China and risk pressure. Lean back toward Washington and renegotiate old assumptions. This is how spheres of influence reassert themselves. At the global level, the message is just as stark. Rules-based order sounds persuasive until force overrides contracts. When that happens, power becomes the rule. China's condemnation of the US is not only moral, it is strategic. It is defending a system where economic ties are meant to outlast political shocks. But systems only endure if they are respected. And right now, that respect is fraying, which leaves us facing the hardest question of all. What happens next? What happens next depends on who ultimately takes control and how far power is willing to go. There are three plausible paths ahead. The first is the optimistic scenario. A new government in Caracas seeks legitimacy. It honors existing agreements, even those signed under Maduro. China restructures debt quietly. Oil revenues are split. Losses are absorbed, not detonated. Stability slowly returns. The second path is murkier. A US-aligned leadership selectively honors obligations. American claims move forward. Chinese ones are delayed, renegotiated, diluted. Beijing accepts partial losses to avoid escalation. The system bends, but does not break. Then there is the worst-case scenario. Agreements are voided outright. Oil assets are weaponized. China is pushed out not just of Venezuela, but of the region's future. Beijing responds not with troops, but with pressure elsewhere. Trade tools, strategic choke points, retaliation that spills far beyond Latin America. This is the paradox of power. When force appears decisive in the short term, it often destabilizes the long term. History tells us this again and again. The real danger here is not conflict. It is normalization. Because once regime change by force becomes acceptable, every investment everywhere becomes conditional. And that changes the world. One final question remains. What should you take away from all this? Let me leave you with this. What happened in Venezuela is not just a story about Trump or China or Nicolas Maduro. It is a story about how fragile the global system really is. For decades, the world ran on an assumption that economics could tame politics, that contracts could outlive leaders, that interdependence would restrain force. That assumption is cracking. When a government can be removed overnight and billions in loans instantly become negotiable, power stops being abstract. It becomes personal, transactional, unforgiving. China understands this now more clearly than ever. So does the United States, and so should you. Because the future will not be decided only by elections or institutions. It will be decided by who controls leverage oil, debt, trade, and precedent. Venezuela is the warning shot. If you want to understand the world you are living in, not the slogans, but the structure beneath them, stay with me. Share this analysis and watch what happens next. Because this story is not over. It is just moving to its next chapter.